Eagle Community Television presents Community Connection with your host, Mike Cooper.
Hello and welcome to Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to our producer, Jeff Durant. We're at historic Fort Hays on the 183 bypass in Hays in the main visitor center. Joining us is Superintendent at Historic Fort Hays, Bob Wilhelm, as we talk about an event appropriate for the season. About this time of the year, we always like to catch Bob and catch up on some of the activities of the fort, and particularly one of the local legends at Historic Fort Hays. First though, Bob, if you will, tell us about the fort hours and admission now.
Okay, we're open 9 to 5 Tuesday through Saturday, and admission's pretty reasonable. It's $5 for adults and $1 for students, and anybody 5 and under is free, and anybody who's a member of the Kansas Historical Society or the Society of Friends of Historic Fort Hays also gets in free.
And that also will help you with other museums as well, too. They've got
well,
a nice
the Historical Society
right.
membership will. The other historic sites around the state, and then the museum at Topeka as well.
A lot to see in the new visitor center now, redesigned here a few months ago, and of course now open.
Well, actually about 2 years ago now.
Oh, come
Mike.
on, it hasn't been that long.
It's been about 2 years.
Oh my goodness, it still looks fresh and brand new.
It does. It was a long time coming, and we've gotten some real good comments on things here. It's not only the visitor center here, but the guardhouse and blockhouse are both renovated as well. And the guardhouse in particular, that's my favorite building now because it's dedicated to the enlisted man. And so that's something we've never had before. And so it talks about what they did on their off time, and of course the guardhouse was the jail, so it talks about that, and it talks about the Buffalo soldiers who were here, and it's got some nice interactive experiences. When you go down there, there are some mannequins that'll end up talking to you and things like that. So it's really pretty interesting.
You'll certainly want to see it, and if you happen to be seeing the community connections at one of the motels, the Historic Fort Hays, easy to find and a very, very reasonable admission charge, so don't miss that. A lot of people stop from all over the country, really all over the world, Bob.
Yeah,
to see
we had
Historic
some
Fort Hays.
folks from England in here the other day, and of course with our German heritage here, we get a lot of Germans through here, but a lot of Scandinavians too. I mean, we get people literally from all over the world. Yeah.
'Tis the season for ghosts and goblins, maybe specters, apparitions and such, and Hays certainly, Historic Fort Hays certainly has one, Bob.
Oh yeah, our most famous, of course, is the Blue Light Lady, Elizabeth Polly. A lot of people don't know her as Elizabeth Polly; they just know her as the Blue Light Lady. So it's kind of she's a legend, really, and she's a part of our folklore, which is she's a part of the makeup of our community here. And what makes a good legend is that there are parts of the story that are verifiable. We know all about her husband, Ephraim Polly, the cholera epidemic that she was here during. That's all a matter of fact. But then there's the unknown part, the ghost part, that you can't really verify. At least we've not been able to verify. For instance, we've been unable to verify Elizabeth Polly herself. The whole story about her is there are missing links in that story, and that's what makes this her a legend, and what makes her kind of an enigma. It's a very interesting story, and a lot of places have individuals like this, but ours is wrapped up in the cholera epidemic that occurred at Fort Hays right when the fort was started in 1867. So,
well, you've got our attention now.
Okay,
Tell us the story, Bob.
Here it goes. When the fort was set up here at the location on the south edge of what's now Hays, the troops, when they first came out, they were living in tents, obviously, because the railroad wasn't here yet, Hays City wasn't here, Rome was here, but Hays City hadn't been built yet. And the troops came here from the previous location over south of Walker when the flood hit that fort. And so they moved it over here, and they were just living in tents. They had tents set up everywhere. Well, there was a group of soldiers who were assigned here, and they came here from Fort Riley, and where there had been a cholera outbreak. And so they think these soldiers brought cholera here, and the doctor started treating patients, and Ephraim Polly was the hospital steward. And the hospital steward that's an actual rank in the Army, or it was an actual rank in the Army, and it was someone who had an interest in medicine, but was not a full-fledged doctor. And a hospital steward helped with administering medications and that sort of thing, just whatever the doctor, kind of a male nurse, helped with whatever the doctor needed. And typically, if a hospital steward was married, his wife became the hospital matron. And the matron would change bedpans and sheets and, again, whatever the hospital steward needed to have done, whatever he couldn't do, the hospital matron would do. And the story goes that he married Elizabeth right before he came to Hayes. So they hadn't been married very long. We don't know her age, but the story goes that she was a young woman, very compassionate and caring and so on. And she spent a lot of time in the hospital ward, which at this point was just several big hospital tents that were set up, sitting with a lot of the patients. Now, cholera was a real fast-acting disease. It was waterborne organisms and usually spread by unhygienic bathroom habits. And so they said you could be healthy in the morning and dead by sundown. So it was but if you made it through the first 24 hours, chances were you were going to recover from it. So not everybody died. But there were a lot of soldiers, a lot of civilians who were dying of cholera. And she would sit with these guys and hold their hands while, if they were really, really ill, and a lot of times hold their hands as they died, which is obviously a real good way to contract the disease. And she told her husband, she said, if I should die here of this disease, there's a hill south of town here, or south of the fort, this tallest little knoll about a couple miles south, that she'd like to be buried on. And the story goes that she would go out there in the afternoon or evening to kind of get away from the horrors of the hospital and the disease and all that kind of stuff. Now, this part of the story is a little funny because, not funny, haha, but it was a little strange in that it's 2 miles south. And this is a time when there were a lot of conflicts with American Indians and the soldiers, and being 2 miles away from the fort by yourself was probably not a real good idea. But the story goes that she would go out there, and it was a very peaceful area, and she'd kind of regenerate, put the horrors of the day behind her, and it would get her ready to go the next day. She said she would like to be buried out there. Well, she's going to be a legend, so she's got to die. So she catches the disease and she dies, and they bury her out on the hill. Now, when they went out to the top of the hill, the soil was very shallow there because it's the top of the hill, and the hills are there because of the limestone. So it takes longer to wear that away. So they couldn't get a 6-foot deep hole there. So they had to go down the side of the hill until they found an area where they could get a proper grave made, and they buried her, and they had a wooden headstone, and that was very common. A lot of the soldiers, in fact, the soldiers at the Fort Hayes Cemetery, when they were first buried, they had wooden headstones as well, and a prairie fire came through and damaged a lot of those. So it's not unusual that the prairie fire could come through and burn up Elizabeth's headstone, or it just rotted away since it was wood and the grave was lost. Well, she starts to be seen in about the 1890s, early 1900s. There are a number of one particular sighting was a farmer, a rancher, had some land out there, and there was a shack out there on the hill. And he was working in the morning, and he saw this woman walk in to the shack. And he hollered at her to see what she was doing, and there was no response or anything. Well, he was real busy, and so he couldn't take the time to go and check that. But later in the day, he went out to see if because no one came out of that shack. And so he got on his horse, took his dog with him, and he said the dog wasn't afraid of anything, wasn't afraid of the devil himself. Well, the dog got close to the shack and turned around and ran home. The horse, likewise, he said he could ride that horse right into hell. And the horse got real jittery and did not, he couldn't get him to go up to the shack, so he had to get off the horse and walk up there. And the door was locked, and he broke the lock and got in, and there was nobody in there. It was all dusty and cobwebs and so on. In the 1950s, right after they built the bypass that goes around Hayes, 183 bypass, the sheriff at that time was making his rounds, and he was driving on the new highway. And Bob Maxwell, who many people knew from the veterans ceremonies and so on that we had.
Former professor at Fort Hays State.
He was a kind of a deputy with the sheriff's department. He was up in the north end of town, and he got a call from the sheriff, and the sheriff was very agitated. And he said, "You got to get down here. I just ran over somebody. I just hit somebody with my car." So Bob zooms down here, and he finds the sheriff, and the sheriff is sitting by the road, and he's very obviously distraught, and he's upset, and he said, "I've looked everywhere and I can't find her." So he said, "Well, come on." Bob said, "Come on, I'll help you look." And so they looked all around, and they couldn't find anything. And he said, and so Bob said, "Well, did you really? Maybe you were, there was just somebody next to the road." He said, "Nope, she was right in front of me. She was wearing a blue dress. She had a bonnet on, and she just appeared, and I'm sure I ran into her." Well, that's one of the more famous stories about Elizabeth Polly. But we do have a couple of stories that we've just recently come across, or have, within the last 10 years or so. We had an event here called Old Pard's Day, where we had a lot of reenactors come in. And pard is a term for partner and buddy, and we had these reenactors come in, and one of them, and they had some various first-person impersonations that they did on the weekend. Well, one of these guys came in early, a day early, and he asked if he could set up his camp in town or on the fort grounds here, and we said, "Of course you can." And so we closed down, and we all went home and did our normal after-work things. And he was out there setting up his tent. Well, it was getting dark, and he looked down on the porch of the guardhouse, and there was a woman in a blue dress walking along the porch. And he said, "Well, I didn't know," he said to himself, "I didn't know we were having any women who were reenactors here." And so he said, "Well, I'll get my tent set up, and I'll go find her and have her come over for a cup of coffee or whatever." And he looked all over, and he couldn't find anything. Well, he had never been here before. He didn't know anything about the Elizabeth Polly story, and he didn't tell anybody because he just kind of dismissed it out of his mind until somebody was telling the story about Elizabeth Polly, and he said, "Well, hey, I just had this experience." So that kind of makes you wonder, a little bit about her. And then the most recent story that we've heard was involved the ag department at the university over here, where a lot of the ag students will bring their horses up, and they keep them at the rodeo grounds over here next to the golf course. And a girl had her horse there, and her horse had gotten away. And this happened probably within the last 3 or 4 years. We haven't really been able to track her down yet to get the true story of exactly when this happened and so on. But she went out to get her horse, and as she was leading her horse back, she saw a woman in a blue dress walking in the pasture. And she hollered to her, said, "Hey, do you need a ride? I've got my car up here. I can, if you need to get back into town." The woman made no reaction, didn't acknowledge anything. She hollered at her again, And again, she didn't make any comment. And then she saw her walk through a barbed wire fence. Well, she kind of kept quiet about this until a little bit later. The ag department chairman was sitting around with a bunch of students one evening, and probably over a couple of beers, and one of the students said, "Hey, Prof, why don't you tell us the story about Elizabeth Polly, because not everybody knew that." And so he says, "Okay," and he starts telling a little bit about Elizabeth Polly, the blue light lady in the blue dress. And he looked over, and this girl was sitting over there, and she was white as a sheet, and he said, "What's the problem?" And she said, "Well, I just saw her." And again, this is a person who had absolutely no knowledge of Elizabeth Polly or the blue light lady. So it kind of makes you wonder, about these stories. Some of them could just be stories, but then you come upon people like this who have nothing to gain by making up this story. They're not trying to vie for attention or anything like that, and yet they've seen something that has affected them in some way, and they've always had this same theme of a woman in a blue dress. So
It kind of makes you wonder.
it kind of makes you go,
Historic Fort Hays and Superintendent Bob Wilhelm and the Blue Light Lady. Keep your eyes open. Thanks for joining us on our Community Connection from Eagle Community Television.